Hey, Jamie.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Where do we find you this week? You're always working with the community somewhere.
Yes, I am in Denver. I actually am working for an organization this week called Mentor National. They support mentor programs within different school districts, and we are supporting their lead mentors in facilitation and coaching so that they might actually support their new mentors as they build relationships with students around the nation.
I love it. When I was an assistant principal and then principal of an elementary school in Columbia, Missouri, actually, we had a program called Stand By Me. It was federally funded. It was a mentoring program. And I must say, when I first sort of learned about it, I thought, because I've seen big brothers, big sisters to some extent be successful, and then other times really let kids down because people will sign up for a period of time and then they disappear. And we're talking about kids who have likely or really rely on, it doesn't matter if you've been through trauma or not. Children rely on the regular participation of an adult who has signed up to be a mentor. And when that doesn't happen, the fallout is pretty extreme for the classroom teacher who now has to, I'm sorry your mentor didn't come today, and then the kid's losing it and all that kind of stuff. So Stand By Me was amazing. And in fact, I still stay in touch with some of the mentors, and I still they stay in touch with the kids who are now adults, and it is tremendous. In fact, one of them bought a home not too far from here, one of the mentors. And so I see her from time to time where we just talk about her mentee. She's not in touch with Demontran anymore. However, we talk about how amazing Demontran was and how he was so capable, and she loved being his mentor and what a great experience it was. I'm just like, this is amazing. So I'm so glad that you're providing training.
Yeah. We'll do a coaching and facilitation work, some basic skills. It actually connects a little bit to what Veronica had to say, but I want to make a plug for my colleague, Greg Meyer, who ran one of the most productive mentor programs ever called Blue Ribbon Mentor Program out of North Carolina, and amazing results as a result of a long-term mentorship that went, if I'm not incorrect, I think went basically from middle school into post-high school. And so these mentorships are relationships that were sustained and changed the trajectory for so many kids.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine, because what I saw on our local level, led by Zona and Jeff Burke, was just tremendous. So we're going to talk about Veronica Sopher. And I actually want to share with you something that I've been dying to talk to you about since I talked to her, because are you familiar? Because I actually wish she and I had talked, and then I learned about these First Amendment auditors. Are you familiar with this new sort of lunacy that is impacting schools across the country? I watch your face right now. If you're just listening, his whole body just deflated. Oh my God.
No, I am not.
Okay. Well, during the conversation
of a sci-fi movie.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, as people are going to listen to this conversation, you're going to hear us talk about clarity versus transparency and things like that. And that's when a week later, I learned about these First Amendment auditors who are showing up in school districts, recording every moment and insisting on seeing everything and wanting, there is a process for getting, it's called a Freedom of Information Act, and you can get information from schools.
You can get
no problem.
Anything.
They're showing up at bus stations, the bus terminals, at facilities. They want unfettered access to schools, and they want to see the libraries, and it's just and all under this sort of umbrella of, I'm a First Amendment auditor and I have a First Amendment right, because this is taxpayer funded, to be able to just walk through your schools. And what they're recording is they're looking for an outlandish response that they then edit and then post. And so there's just hundreds of thousands of followers to these First Amendment auditors. And so I was kind of curious if you knew about them, and sort of, I wish I could go back now and talk to Veronica and be like, okay, tell me about your advice now for schools. Not now as if she couldn't handle it. She totally could. But I would just have been really astounded by this sort of next step around, it's abuse, abusing public officials who are trying to do their very best to protect, honor, value children, their families, and provide just a really valuable education. And it's just another distraction. So anyway, what did you want to ask before we head into this conversation with Veronica Sopher? I know, sorry.
That's intense. That's really intense. I'd be interested to see how principals are handling that. I mean, it doesn't sound too different from the principals that are handling ICE right now as ICE shows up to the schools.
Yeah, it's almost like you approach it from this Vegas perspective. And what I mean by that is, I remember the one time I went to Vegas, I was hoping to get into this steakhouse, and I didn't have a reservation. And they said, we got you one. Yes, you got one. It's 11 p.m. And they were like, said it so excitedly. And I was like, I got excited too. And then it dawned on me like, that's really late. like I didn't actually get the reservation I wanted. So I imagine we could say to them like, absolutely, let's get us your information. Why don't you sit here? We're going to get it for you. And
yeah, exactly.
That would be the move.
The move would be like, oh yeah, 100%.
Exactly.
The gates are wide open at 6:30 tonight. Wide open. Kids are gone.
Exactly.
Things are over.
Here's the form. All right, let's get you scheduled. Oh, good. We got you in. We can get you in today. It's 5:30 or 6 o'clock at night. Absolutely.
6 o'clock tonight after the choir performance.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
If you want to come to the choir performance, which starts at 5:30.
That's right.
You can
I get your ID? I'm
me.
just going to run it because we do that for everybody, just to make sure everybody's safe.
Actually true. Okay. That's actually true.
Anyway, I'll be curious. I'm going to reach out to some school attorneys and kind of see what kind of advice they're giving. But that was sort of my first sort of, I want to be incredibly gracious while also saying no.
Yeah,
no.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I made a connection to Veronica's, like the conversation that you had, more not necessarily her, it is her work, but it was really in the conversation between the mentoring conversation that we just had. And that was that the support that was given to the mentees in these mentor programs and the support that we're giving to the trainers, the mentors that are going to be supporting their younger mentors is about caring for people. It's about empathy. It's about slowing down and listening, not just having not just being advisors to people, but actually trying to understand where their pain point is, where their fear is, where their struggles are. And to do that, you have to slow down. And that's key.
That is really a great way for us to lead into this conversation. So we are thrilled you're here. This is An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I do want to say, as we enter this conversation, in the second half, Veronica talks about something that it could be triggering for an individual who may have experienced the trauma of suicide in their family or in their school system. And so I just want to be mindful of that. We do talk about suicide and a real experience that Veronica had at a school that she was supporting. Alrighty, let's head into it.
Let's do it.
Today on An Imperfect Leader, our guest is Veronica Sopher. Veronica is an award-winning media-trained public information officer with 25 plus years of experience in communications, also public relations, and customer service. And she counsels superintendents and school leaders on everything from board relations to crisis, media events to bond elections. And she has served as the chief communications officer, a director of public information, the executive director of school and community relations, and the assistant superintendent of community and government relations in some of Texas's largest school districts. That is a lot, but sometimes I try to keep it really short, but there's so much to just share about everything that you've done, Veronica. Welcome to An Imperfect Leader. We're thrilled you're here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, I could have gone on and on about your accomplishments, including that you also served as the president of the Texas School Public Relations Association, and that you remain actively involved in the Texas Association for School Boards. So you really are an impressive leader, and I'm really thrilled to have you. And when I was superintendent in a considerably smaller district, although large for Missouri, we were 19,000 students, 300 square miles. We were rural, urban, and suburban. And then I looked at like one of your smaller districts, like Fort Bend, 76,000 students. So
yeah.
So,
it's all perspective, right? Because what is small to one person is not small to someone
I know,
else.
but everything's bigger in Texas.
Yes.
We know that. Everything's bigger in Texas.
It is true.
But when I was superintendent, the person that I worked most closely with really was my director of school communications and community relations. And Michelle's office was right next to mine. And I must have communicated with her like 100 times a day, sometimes really navigating high stakes moments. So in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension, leaders learning work. And embedded in that dimension is the power of language. That can be framing, it can be metaphors, it can be storytelling. And Michelle really helped me quite a bit, especially when leading world cafes, bringing your whole community together to tackle one big issue and really harvesting the wisdom of your community. So my question, so thank you you're like, is this a podcast where I get to talk? Yes, I promise it is. But my question is, superintendents often find themselves, they're really navigating high stakes moments, whether it's communicating a bold new vision or responding to a crisis or addressing a skeptical community sometimes. What are some strategies that you recommend for leaders who really want to build trust and then shape that clear and compelling narrative that resonates for stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it really starts from identifying what the pain point is. And so regardless of the size of district or where in the country I'm working with a district, the first question I ask a superintendent or a leader in the conversation is, what problem are we trying to solve? We have to very clearly hone in on the pain point. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Now, yes, it is often layered in a lot of complex issues, and there can be more than one answer to the question. But at its core, your message is really has to be tailored to answer that. So when people struggle with answering that question, it gives us an opportunity to really separate some of those layers and peel back the onion to really get to the core. And oftentimes it is about an emotion. Now, not always, but oftentimes it's about an emotion. So having a clear, defined understanding of what emotion exists and then how it is driving a perception, then it allows us to go in and start to identify ways to attack it or ways to dissect it and find out what is missing and what we can do. But we cannot come up with a solution or a strategy or a message or anything until we're super clear on the problem we're trying to solve.
What is there one that comes to mind for you? Because I imagine you've entered a school district in a support role to help that superintendent, and they're talking about, here's the issue I'm dealing with. And it actually turns out to be, that's not, you're dealing with the emotion. Let's talk about the issue that is, and I'm just kind of curious, does one come to mind? It could be way back, so it's not a current one that you're working on.
Yeah.
But I'm really kind of curious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think at the end of the day, most of the time it's fear, but whether it's books, whether it's a gun on a campus, whether it is polarized discussions at a board meeting with an elected board that is completely and totally at odds philosophically, when you really dig down into it, it's fear. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear, lack of control. It is always rooted in someone's desire to gain control of a conversation. And so I think when you think about conversations about books, or when you think about a conversation about safety and security in a community, thinking back to some specific examples, the emotion is so heated and is sometimes not articulated well because there's so much fear driving it. And so it's almost like it's a misfiring of the brain, and there's distraction because they want to blame someone, but it's their desire to control that emotion. And usually when we can get to that, then we can talk about it. Is it really about the way the library is sourcing books, or is it about the library vendor? Is it about the training with the librarians? Or is it really a sense of fear that you might be feeling about what exists inside of our library program? Or is it really the books on the shelf? And so those are the types of questions we ask to help identify what we need to do to frame some perceptions.
That's really helpful. And in fact, it made me think about, I had this really, I thought a bold idea. It was 2013. It was around a time where Jeffrey Canada really was inspiring and continues to inspire, and Kwame, who now follows at the Harlem Children's Zone, trying to think about how do we create a space that could be a year-round school that provides enrichment, that engages families so that they are also having an opportunity to maybe work at the school, or graduates can come back and in the summer during their downtime and work at the school, and just really create that community school. And so I had this school in mind that was Central City, often overlooked, often considered underfunded. And I brought together our faith-based community and our community elders. And I said, this is what I want to share with you and it was dead on arrival. They were like, what? No way. And I hadn't even thought about the fear component of, if you have a beat on the system, particularly in Missouri, and the school you're speaking of was at one point a segregated school, you want to bring that back. And that scares us. So any of the other pieces about investing in the school and redoing the building and hiring the very best staff and providing every opportunity and really just investing, that was all lost because I hadn't tackled what I think you're saying is the fear.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the fear. And, I always tell people it's okay to acknowledge that the fear exists in a conversation, especially around politics, right? We've got very decisive boards having really deep conversations that can get passionate and a little loud. And at its core, it's fear. And it's okay to acknowledge that we're experiencing that and then ask some questions about what that looks like. Now, I will say oftentimes anger is what the exterior conversation sounds like, but when you really listen to the words and separate the tone and you listen, then you realize, oh, this is stemming from fear, which is stemming from scarcity. And scarcity is something that we inherently have, and it's an instinct so that we can protect ourselves. And I just remind people, it's a fight or flight mechanism. We should be thankful that it's pinging us to be scared, because once somewhere in our DNA, when that scarcity existed, it prevented us from being healthy and strong and safe and secure and all those things. So when we start talking about fear in conversations like this in the school space, we have to remember at its core, it's a good thing. It's a signal. And it's just an opportunity for us to pay attention.
I imagine that similar advice to a superintendent or a principal when you were in the school districts embedded. And principal, for me, the worst thing to hear was when someone would say, I'm done with that parent. You're like, no, we're never done because they're a child, right? And when you say, well, tell me more about what's happening. And they say, well, they come in, they yell at me all the time and they're bashing me on Facebook and I just can't take it anymore. And look, it was hard for me as a superintendent, particularly during a pandemic when I had a very divided community. And so, yeah, you just read these things about, you're like, is that me that they're talking about? However, when you take a step back and acknowledge the fear, right? You're talking about my kid. I want my kid to succeed, but you've called me now 7 times to pick up my kid for a suspension because they were defiant or disrespectful or they threw something or they pushed someone. And so it's like almost like sifting for gold. What are we trying to hear from the parent? I need help. I'm looking to you to help me. You're the educator. Please help me.
Right.
I hadn't even thought of it as the fear piece as much as, and to try to separate it. What is the issue as opposed to stop focusing on the emotion?
Yeah. Yeah. And really at its core, that's what we have to do with customer service. Not to digress too much, but when we think about our frontline staff that are dealing with angry parents and a lot of visitors that have a lot of animosity, and we have to separate the bad behavior from the concern being expressed. And that requires us to listen through a different lens, and it requires us to be whole and confident in what we're doing. And so I think for leaders, we have to remind our team that we're here for students, and this is what our district's vision is or mission or what our goals are, our priorities, or whatever those guiding documents are. When we're rooted inside of that, it's much easier to separate the bad behavior from the concern being expressed.
That makes sense. If you're just joining us on An Imperfect Leader, my guest is Veronica Sopher, an award-winning media-trained public information officer and founder of Veronica Sopher K-12 Communications Consulting. I remember when I first became a superintendent, an experienced superintendent told me that I can do a lot of wonderful things for my community, but if the community doesn't trust me, I'm gone. And so I really think about that. Particularly, I was excited to talk with you because trust is a big part of the job for every good reason. You're responsible for the public's children. And so I've now spent the last 3 years talking with superintendents all over the country on this podcast. And many of them will say that they struggle with balancing a desire for transparency, no doubt, and being able to control as well, like when it comes to communicating with the public. And so that balance between transparency and then control. And especially, I think, in times of controversy or big change. And so putting your consulting hat on and your past experiences, how can leaders strike that right balance to maintain trust without fueling that misinformation or panic?
That's a really great question. And there's never a uniform answer because it's different.
No, I need one answer. That's it.
Yeah,
done.
one answer.
Simple,
It's
right?
one size
Right.
fits all,
That's
right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think for us, the most challenging thing is to understand that that benchmark is moving constantly. There's an ebb and flow. So when people feel safe and they feel like their students are succeeding and the district is doing well, then the need for transparency is different than if there's a shooting in a neighboring community or in another state, or there's some sort of heightened fear happening outside of the education circle. Then that needle moves. And so our expectations for transparency shifts as well. So I think acknowledging that it's always an ebb and flow. And it's kind of like people, our best on a Monday at 8 a.m. is not our best on a Friday at 2:45 p.m. Community is the same way. Our listening is the same way. Our expectations of communication is different. And the other thing I remind people is that there's a balance for the system, and then there's a balance for you. Now, part of your brand as a leader is establishing your communication methods, and some superintendents are very engaging on X. Others are very engaging on TikTok, depending on what your personality style is. So you're going to have different levels of your ability to engage with people and be, quote, transparent. So I think establishing yourself in your leadership and establishing the best way you feel confident connecting with people is going to be the method or the mode that you use. And the cadence has to be determined on what's happening. So if you are in an emergency situation and you are a superintendent who's very active on X, your transparency might look like just driving people back to the website. District just posted an update, click here, versus I can report that all the students have been evacuated. They're now, I mean, you're literally giving details. So I think
right. And in an incident command structure, that's not the superintendent's job, right? I mean, you would advise like, hey, this is what I need you to be doing right now, right?
Exactly. But I have seen leaders who their, not only their expectation, but their board's expectation is that they be the voice. Sure. And so I think that is a challenge if you are going from one system to the other. But I have seen superintendents where that is the expectation, and you very often will see them doing that. Now, again, in a different model, in a bigger system where you have your own police department or you have a command center, yes, it's all streamlined. But in my smaller communities, I do see that happen most often because
that's the person they're trusting in that moment. That's
exactly
that's the face.
Yep. And so the board expects the superintendent to be not only on the dais, but at the press conferences delivering the information, versus in a larger system where it's going to be your PIO or your chief communications officer or your director of media relations. Your superintendent might be available for additional comments, but at its core, your system dictates that level of transparency to answer your question. So I think a new leader has to come in and establish their brand, because their brand is their promise.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. So can I go back to the word transparency? Because this is a term that I always struggled with, because I always felt like I was an open book trying to give any answer that anyone had. And I spoke with a superintendent who provided for me, I think, a little bit of help, because what she said was, Peter, people don't necessarily want to know every bit of how you made the decision. That's not transparency. What they really want is clarity. Why are you making that decision? How did you get there? And how is it contributing to where you said, in terms of your brand, where you said you were going to be taking us? And I'm kind of curious about that from your own perspective, just because you've done this work for a long time, you advise others. How do you handle that term transparency? Because it just seems to get thrown in superintendents' faces all the time. When someone doesn't like a decision, then they just say, there's no transparency here. And so, and then it spirals.
It does. And I really like the point you made about clarity, because at its core, it's about clarity. It's about simplicity. Your audience is very keen on what it is they want. What's in it for me as a reader, as a consumer of your information, as a follower on your social media channels. I'm in it to find out what's in it for me, my children, my family, our situation. So when you can clearly identify that at the very beginning, then it creates less need for additional comments, for additional information. When you give them something and it doesn't answer that question, they want more. And then they start asking more, and they start reaching out for more. Then that distrust starts to really show itself. And if you've got repeated incidences of that happening throughout your tenure as a leader, then all of a sudden you're labeled as someone who isn't trustworthy, right? So the best gift you can give yourself as a leader is to articulate clearly and quickly, so that you don't have to release information often that is clouded and can confuse people and just clogs the pipeline.
That makes sense. I'd like to ask you a question that I ask every guest who comes on our show. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate for you?
You know, the first thing I thought of was, we're all imperfect leaders. For me, that's the natural, obvious. Yes, we all are. But I think there's beauty in that, because if we only learn from our failures and we only learn from tripping and falling and picking ourselves back up, and if we are dedicated lifelong learners, then wouldn't we strive to be imperfect leaders, right? Because that's the only way we grow. And so, yeah, that's how it landed for me.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest today is Veronica Sopher, an award-winning media-trained public information officer and founder of Veronica V. Sopher K-12 Communications Consulting. Now, in this segment, what we do is we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made or were a part of, and then we discuss it. So, Veronica, what happened?
Unfortunately, like many communities, we have had safety and security issues. And on one of my campuses several years ago, we had a young lady take her life in the bathroom and did so with a firearm. And it was, we'd all practiced. We knew what to do. There were protocols, there were flip charts. Everyone had a role. We would do tabletop drills. There was no immediate threat, so that had been neutralized in the moment. But there was a lot of things that happened around it, and it got very loud. And not only managing the media, but the immediate safety of the students and ensuring that we had a pretty good idea of what was happening. All that unfolded very quickly. So what I would say is when we do a look back and we break down where our systems failed us, I would say the biggest challenge in that is practicing. Because you can practice for all the scenarios, but at the end of the day, when someone's life has been taken, it is very emotionally charged and we forget what we're supposed to do. You have the flip chart in front of you, but your emotions take over. Some of us are better at compartmentalizing than others. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that.
You are talking about one of our greatest fears as educators. We go into the profession to care for kids, and we often say, my first job is to keep you safe, and to know that a child who felt likely that they had no alternative, that they had lost all hope, that they had no connection or relationship, I can't even imagine. And to have to lead through that, and then to, in your role, to lead and advise through that. Wow. So what I heard you saying was, so here's the situation that unfolded. And Stephen Pruitt, who was once the commissioner of education for Kentucky, now the president of the Southern Regional Education Board, he was on our show and he spoke about when responding to a crisis like this, that we have a lot of experience planning. And what I hear you saying is what may have gotten overlooked was even more practice. We had the plans and we've done some tabletops, but really don't discount the importance of making it a muscle memory so that when you're getting into this, he said that in the moment when there is a crisis, that many of us will rise up and we will do well. And that there's a piece that's missing, which is the reflection afterwards. How do we take care of each other? Something has just happened in this space that just absolutely has profound ramifications for the children who have lost a peer, for the building in terms of its cultural field has been shattered to some extent, or at least jarred, because there's a sense of safety when you're in school and then that's not there anymore for teachers and for others. So I can go on and on. I think you could advise me even more. When I say all of that, would you say that it's the planning piece, the practicing piece is the piece that got overlooked in terms of, it sounds like what unfolded was maybe things didn't go as we had hoped it would go.
Right. So we had mapped out scenarios where something like that could happen, or some version of a child lost due to a firearm injury. But we hadn't accounted for all the technicalities. Like in that particular instance, as we were shutting down the building, a student pulled a fire alarm. So we had to evacuate the building. It was a high school. So we had to evacuate a couple thousand students because of a fire alarm that was pulled. We were in a completely separate part of the building that we'd already isolated. We had to wait for the judge to come and pronounce the deceased. And we knew an ambulance was going to come, or we assumed an ambulance would come, right? Because everything we'd practiced said that an ambulance was part of the, first responders would come. But in this case, that's not what happened. In this case, it was actually a couple hours later, as we were trying to get students, back in and get their backpacks and get them dismissed and let people know that there had been an incident and half the building was locked down, that it was instead, because the county we were in didn't have a coroner, it was actually a funeral home that came. And so all of a sudden, instead of an ambulance, it was a funeral home. And instead of it being immediate, it was a couple hours later because we had to wait for the judge to come to pronounce the deceased. And then you think about the technical parts of the staff that knew her, or him in that case. And the student has threads and connections throughout the entire campus. And we don't think about the custodians, and we don't think about the bus driver who may not see him or her on the route that day and just say, hey, are we waiting? All of those things that we didn't practice all the things that we didn't know to practice. We had counselors, we had a crisis response team. We knew we had a vendor for the biohazard cleanup that was required after something like that. So we technically had everything, but we didn't think through the things that we didn't know, the types of questions we were going to get. You know, anytime there's a crisis, if a client district calls, the first thing I say is, if we've lost a student or a student was seriously injured, we say, make sure we pause notifications for that parent's communication system, even for all the students in that they have. So I've got a
right. I was going to say, because they have siblings, then also you have to think about that ripple effect. You talked about the threads connecting. My gosh, if there's a sibling at an elementary school, well, how does that teacher know or the counselor know to? I mean, wow.
Yeah, and it wasn't the first time that had happened in our system. It had just been a few years, and technology had changed significantly. So all of the traps we thought we'd run previously, that we had new traps. And quite honestly, that was long enough ago that if it happened again in one of the districts I support, I would have to run new traps, because the way we communicate is completely different. In that situation, we had media. It was a large media market. So it was easy for all the TV stations to get there quickly and, have a place to designate them. But in a small community, or in a community now, a suburban district where maybe they don't have as many reporters because the media landscape has changed, they wouldn't send a camera out. They might send somebody with a cell phone. So a lot has changed since then. And we have to be mindful that whatever system we have in place needs to be revisited often.
I imagine also, lastly, just thinking about this, is that the first moment you hear shots fired, you don't know whether or not this is a coordinated event, this is a single shooter, that this is someone, what their intent is. Mm-hmm. So you said that then the fire alarm was pulled. So you have kids sort of sheltering in place. Then the fire alarm was pulled. And then, so do people leave? Do they not leave? And I mean, all the sort of Alice training that we do sort of begins to get questioned and confused. So it goes back to your initial, we need to practice. We had talked about what would happen. You ignore it, or you don't ignore it, or you wait for a signal that says there's credibility, there's a fire. Otherwise, you remain sheltered in place, or if you've been evacuating, go, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then being mindful of the alternatives. What if it had been raining? And in this exact instance, it was a very hot day. It was over 100 degrees. And we had high school students outside, and there was only so many trees, so many shade trees. You have 2,000 people outside. You cannot control for that. And so we didn't have enough bottled water. We had to have food service ship them in from a couple of different places. And we literally had cabinet members driving to the local grocery stores and filling up their vehicles with bottled water so that we could distribute it to students as we were doing the dismissal process. So what we had not practiced, to your point at the very beginning, was we had not practiced all the weather variables. We had a plan if it was raining, but we didn't have a plan if it was 102 degrees outside. So those are the kinds of things that I think we have to be mindful of and be very flexible on.
What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships formed as a result of this experience?
I don't know if I learned it, but it solidified for me how trauma bonds leaders. Whether it's something political in nature, whether it's a tragedy, whether it's a natural disaster. Being in Texas, I'm in the Gulf Coast area, hurricanes, shutting down schools, having tornadoes, any type of significant loss of any kind, especially life, really bonds leaders. And that can't be taught, and it can't be rehearsed. And it happens in an instant. It doesn't happen over time. You may know this person for 2 weeks, and all of a sudden you're bonded in a way that will never change. And it could be someone that you've been working with for 7 or 8 years, and you never got super, super close until that moment. So I think for me, the realization that trauma is a very strong glue.
December 16, 2016, there was a frozen fog that came across and crippled the entire state of Missouri. None of us saw it on the weather because it was a fog. It wasn't any kind of real weather, but yet everything froze. The cars all crashed. Buses couldn't get anywhere. We didn't get kids home until 1 a.m. I mean, they had to stay at the school and all this it was really incredible. To your point, December 16th every year, we're all texting each other because we all kind of went through it. We still are happy anniversary, because that was an amazing display of the community coming together to take care of each other.
Right.
But it is still, and luckily no one was injured. And I mean, no one was hurt, no one was injured, and no loss of life. It was a major inconvenience for the entire community, but it is still one of those things that bonds you forever. This is December 16th, oh, hey, it's December 16th.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I think we have to do as leaders, imperfect leaders, is recognize that there is a silver lining and there's a gift in everything. The Chinese symbols for crisis actually also indicate opportunity and learning. And so there's always a silver lining in every tragedy. And I think that's a gift that nature gives us to take from it as we come out of the other side, and how we leverage it and how we grow from it and how we use it to shape what we do next is really important.
What frustrated you as you were experiencing that, as you look back?
What frustrated me personally is my great skill at compartmentalizing and not expressing empathy as much as I could have. And I don't know if I just didn't know enough to do it, or didn't have the patience for it, or didn't want to allow myself. But I think in hindsight, I needed to and should have and would have wished that I expressed a little bit more empathy. But I was so matter of fact, get things done, take care of business. People were having appropriate emotional responses, and I got frustrated that I wasn't allowing myself, or that didn't come to me. And I felt like the lone man out because I was so busy taking care of things. That frustrated me.
That is really an interesting and profound reflection, because on one hand, your job in that moment is to coordinate everybody. And so you can't necessarily take a step back and express how you're feeling, this loss of community, loss of life in the community, because everyone is also looking to you to make sure that information is accurate, that, and you're often, I always think of your position as almost like what's the word? It's like the chief of staff in a lot of ways. Like you help connect everybody to everything and keep the message consistent as well. Because otherwise there's confusion, and confusion creates frustration and anxiety and fear and false starts. And so all of that falls on your shoulders. It's interesting to me on how you think you could have also demonstrated empathy in that moment. And maybe, so I was really just kind of curious how you said that and why you said that and what that would have looked like.
Yeah, I think since then, whenever we've had tragedy in other districts that I support in my consulting role, I make it a priority to very clearly start my engagement as a district is going through something with empathy, expressing my sympathy, expressing my condolences, acknowledging that people might feel a particular way.
So you assume people know my heart. They know I care about it. But I've got a job to do. Whereas you're now starting with, let's just take a moment. We've lost a life.
Yeah.
This is someone's child, grandchild, sibling. This person had hopes and dreams. And I can't even begin to even fathom how this family is feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a job to do in this moment. And let me talk about that. Right, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think if you frame it that way, especially not being an in-house member of the team, then it gives people that safety, that sense of safety, that you're here to help and you're not here to take advantage. Because again, we're operating from fear. And if there is a lack of expertise or lack of experience in the room around something like this, with media relations, board relations, accuracy and messaging, consistency, just some of the logistical things, then I'm brought in. But they also this team may not know me. So I need to lay the groundwork and allow myself. And I think too, part of it is age, right? As you mature further along in your leadership role, you start to remember how important it is to leave people with a feeling. Yes. And I think younger in my career, I was so much about deadlines and media, and we got to get this done and we can talk about it later, but we got to do this and we got to do that. And I think I stole opportunities from myself to really connect with the team that way. But I will also say, and maybe it's not a regret, maybe it's just a reflection and a learning opportunity. But I would say too, I have built a career on my ability to do that. So I think I acknowledge that it's a gift I've been given and I need to leverage it, but then also just enhance it in other ways.
So you're basically answering the last question, which is, in the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience?
In the end, we were able to have a really great dialogue with the community about what students needed to make sure they had access to highly qualified medical teams and resources to talk about things that were happening, whether personally or in school. We also brought some nonprofits to the table and were able to forge some great relationships so that our staff also had access. And I think it created an opportunity, at least in that community, to be mindful of the impact that mental health supports or lack of mental health supports exist in that community. So it brought a lot of attention to the source issue, and we were able to really make some change. And for that, I'm really proud.
That's fantastic. And you landed the plane there because you went back to, let's not focus on the emotion. Let's get to what is the issue at hand. You must be a trained professional in this. Let me ask you a question, the last one. What advice do you have for an aspiring leader? So someone going into the superintendency.
I would say jump and find your wings on your way down. It's really about letting the excitement and the passion and the calling that you feel drawn to guide you in your decision making. Yes, there will be a lot of reasons, and logic is incredibly important. And yes, we have to do plus deltas. And yes, we have to list pros and cons. Yes, all those things are true. And we do have to analyze, right? We can't just let emotions drive us. But I think we can take a leap of faith because we only get one shot to do this, and don't waste the opportunity.
And maybe allow your PIO to be your parachute. If you're just going to jump and you feel like your wings have not yet fully developed, they'll help you sort of get down.
I love that.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Great add-on.
Because otherwise, I just worry. It's like flat. Our guest today was Veronica Sopher, an award-winning media-trained public information officer, founder of Veronica Sopher K-12 Communications Consulting. And I always write little notes as I'm talking. And, you started with talking about the pain point. I was like, oh, that's really interesting about like, what is it the problem that you're trying to solve? So for superintendents, really taking that step back and seeing as you're separating emotion from the issue, what is it we're trying to solve? And then bringing in people who are most impacted by that decision to really help you get there. So whether it's about books, whether it's about guns on campus, whether it's about phones and phone use, whether it's about budget woes, making those decisions in isolation or with your cabinet is really going to turn into a much bigger issue if you bring in those who are most impacted and do that really thoughtfully. And separating emotion from the issue, I think, is really important. I just wrote so many other notes as well. I learned so much from you today, and I know so did our superintendents around the nation. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Yeah, you bet. It was a great conversation. Loved it.
And we're back.
We are.
I think everything's great. Here's what I was resonating with. It's the after action review here that is just heavy.
Yeah.
And I loved, you actually said it during the interview, her reflection about knowing what to do, but not empathizing. What hit me like a ton of bricks.
All I was doing was echoing or mirroring back what she saw as an area that she overlooked. I'm so technically adroit. I am so incredibly skilled at this job, and I want to prove it. And so I'm going to move into, first I do this, then I do this, then I will do this,
exactly.
Then I do that. And if it weren't for some of the conversations we had with like people like Stephen Pruitt, who also talked about a disaster that he was responding to, is really first being there for the people. And then I think, reflecting on, but you do have a job to do. And so how do you try to find that balance of for them to see your heart, do your job, return with the heart work, HEART. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, and she talks about it earlier, when that emotion can cloud the issue when it's basically when you're dealing with people's fears. If they're afraid of something and they're unclear about their fear. This makes me think of Dr. Chavez Moreno, where I sort of talked about the work that I do and that we do, and that Veronica does similar work to what we do, although hers is in the communication lane. Ours falls into the communication lane at times, but really ours is about the skill, building the skill for the leader to do what Veronica often does. And that is like, do you know how to slow the group down enough to listen and release some of the emotions, some of the frustration, anger, etc., so that they can think more clearly? I don't think of these two things as separate. I don't think no one's brain goes, okay, that's enough emotion. Let me just think logically. It doesn't work like that. They're intertwined, but you can't think clearly and thus logically if you're just in emotion, if your cortisol.
I was about to say, Jamie, I have seen examples where cortisol and adrenaline are surging and there is no logical thinking going on.
No logical way.
Pure emotion that you're dealing with. And then obviously, you're in this sort of like the brainstem. You're just stuck in that fight or flight. You are not in a sort of conscious state or the your prefrontal cortex or your frontal lobe making rational and reasonable decisions.
I make this comparison regularly where if let's say you're leading a meeting and it's a challenging topic and suddenly you see 10 hands raised all at once. Here's what not to do. Call on them one at a time. You do not do that because if you do, no one will listen to each other at all. In fact, they'll just hold the thing that they want to say, the thing that they're carrying. And you could even acknowledge them and say, hey, Peter, I see that your hand's up. I'm coming to you next. Your hand will remain raised. It won't go down. In that moment, everyone in that room has to release some emotion so that then when they say what they have to say, it'll come out more clearly for them. They have to repeat it. It's where, it's so funny. I find this fascinating. They're like, well, why would they repeat it? They've already said it once. Redundancy is a human being's friend. Why don't people realize that the whole point for our brains to get better at something is you have to do it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And so as a leader, what Veronica was talking about was like, find it what they're afraid of. Ask the right question so that they can get to the point of like, here's what I actually care about. That's the root of the problem or the pain point that she started with. You get to that and you show
she
empathy.
highlights, she says she advises leaders to ask, what problem are we trying to solve? I'd like to come back though to all the hands raised.
Yeah.
What advice do you give them to do? Okay, so 10 hands go up and you say,
10 hands go up.
I see what I just said. Struck note.
Turn to a partner. Everybody I'll put 3 minutes, 4 minutes on the clock here. And I want you to take turns. Make sure that each person gets equal time. But what's coming up for you right now based on what we're talking about? And let them literally just blah out all of their words, say all their words at once, and then say, okay, we're going to come back. What are some of the things that you shared with your partners? Now, people are going to raise their hands again, but some of the steam has been let out of the pressure pot. Yeah.
Understood. I had somebody who listened and affirmed what I had to say, or at least I had someone who heard what I had to say.
The purpose truly is to let the people who are carrying the most release. That's the purpose. And not do it one at a time because it's just going to blow up.
Yeah. As we come to the end of our sort of reflection, I want to make sure we talk a little bit more about the second part, her after action review, because this was a real aha for me. And actually in the spring, I included this in my newsletter that goes out to about 30,000 educational leaders every other week, which is how AI is now being leveraged to create these tabletop exercises that can create these variables that had not been anticipated previously. And so
So tell me what a tabletop exercise is. Explain that
I'm
to
so
me.
sorry. Absolutely.
That's okay.
So I was in a town that had a nuclear reactor. There were only one. It was a research reactor. There were only one other in North America. So the pharmaceutical companies used it to create this dye that could be injected into your body to see whether or not you had like blockage or something like that. And its half-life was like, it had to be transported quickly. And so it being located in the middle of the country, this reactor allowed it to get to the West Coast and the East Coast and the South because we were right in the center of the country. Okay. Well, there was a tabletop exercise being done in the region, in our county and with the city to say, tabletop being, let's walk through if there were a nuclear meltdown of this reactor. How would we each respond and be ready for such an event? And so a tabletop exercise is where you anticipate a natural disaster, a man-made disaster, some type of event, and then all the different moving parts and how they're going to react and respond to that event. And then you pause and the facilitator says, okay, now this happened. The winds have changed. We thought they were coming from the west. They're now coming from the north. So what are you going to do? Kind of thing. And so that's what a tabletop exercise is. And so they'll do them for tornadoes. They'll do them for hurricanes. They'll do them for an active shooter. They'll do them and they're typically sort of prefabricated. So there's a facilitator kind of walking through the cards. And so her point was, we practice all these things. We didn't anticipate, oh my gosh, we had a deceased child that we thought a coroner would come and facilitate the transfer of this child, remains. No, they needed to wait for a judge and they waited 2 hours. And then someone pulled the fire alarm and all these sort of things they hadn't anticipated. And so her point was, you got to regularly do them and keep practicing. You can't say,
So it's
we
muscle
did that
memory.
one once.
Right. Right.
Did that.
Love
And
that.
so I know people do them for their own homes too. If there were a fire, where would you go? Who would get the pets? Where would they be put? Where are documents?
Yeah.
All those kinds of things. And yet I thought to myself, like, we've talked about it. I don't think we've practiced it in a long time.
It makes me think of, sorry to do this, but it makes me think of the show that's on right now called The Rehearsal, where, this comedian, gosh, somebody will share their name. In fact, why don't you give us 5 stars and share the name of the comedian that does this show?
Boom. I love it.
That basically rehearses and helps people rehearse a thing over and over and over so that every detail is thought through and you do it over and over and over. Again, redundancy, so that you are as practiced as you can be with with multiple possible variables. Doesn't mean you'll get all of them, because you can't. That's the saying that we've said a zillion times on this podcast. Everybody's plan is great until people show up, right? Nobody planned for the fire alarm to be pulled. And all of which within this horrible, absolutely devastating situation, that if you can do the tabletop exercise or some other rehearsal enough times so that the technicals become muscle memory, you are then, this is the saying, you'll be more available emotionally. And it sounds like this was one of Veronica's reflections, like being out. She wishes she had been more empathetic in that space. And man, I hear you.
I know I mentioned right before we listened to the conversation about Stephen Pruitt and the work that they had done in Kentucky.
And I deeply remember that.
Well, I had a follow-up conversation with him recently where he said they have actually begun that implementation of the piece that he was so excited about, where all counselors are going through training to think about the aftermath, not just the planning and the execution of when the event is happening, but that next piece is often overlooked and was a glaring oversight for them. I mean, it was just in terms of overlooked, was how do we recover from such an event? And so I wish I'd asked her about that as well. If I look back on my post-it note of why didn't you? I wish I'd asked, so what does it look like as you're advising school districts about the recovery piece?
Oh my goodness. That makes me want to ask and follow up. I love that reflection, Peter. I would say that makes me want to ask superintendents, what do you put out communication wise a year from the event, 2 years from the event? This is a child. So you with your colleagues are saying happy anniversary to the freezing frog. The freezing frog. Oh my goodness. That's amusing because it was hard to deal with. But you're not talking about a child's death. And in this case, like, this impacts the entire community.
Yeah.
How do you, and everything is going on all at once. You're always dealing with what's current, but that reflection time, the recovery time that's going to take years.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to bring something to light for you that you may not be thinking about just because you haven't walked in the shoes of superintendent. I would say they absolutely need to start thinking about what will it look like a year from now. And at the same time, be mindful of the fact that during the grieving process, anger and blame become a part of it. And so they also may be then navigating where the family accuses the school and says, you're the reason why this happened. And so then you have to balance, like, how do I honor and value our loss of life and community while also managing lawsuits and accusations and all those types of things as well? It may be that it absolutely becomes the role of the counselor, who's seen as the director of counseling, not the superintendent. So maybe it's just as easy as to say, we need to do this. It's super important, because unfortunately, sometimes it's now the superintendent is managing with the district's attorneys how to figure all that stuff out.
God, it's that part. Yeah, I don't like that part.
No, I know.
Yeah. I understand. Basically what I want to say is I understand that. I guess as someone who hasn't walked in the shoes, it makes me wonder how I would walk in the shoes, right? Would I delegate in that way? Would I be put in a position where I have to delegate in that way? I'm interested to think about it that way. I mean, maybe this is
imagine knowing
as an associate superintendent, I'm thinking, like, for those of you that are so currently associate superintendents listening or principals listening, and you're thinking about the superintendency, I wonder what you would do. What would you do in this situation? And how would you follow up with Stephen Pruitt's advice around recovery time?
Right. Well, I imagine as you're building that recovery plan, it actually includes someone who's thinking about the first days after this event, the first week after, the first month, the first 3 months, and then year. And then you'll figure out what your role will be in that, because I guess the whole point of all of this human-centered leadership work is you're not the one and only leader. It's leaders at all levels. And so they'll help direct you as you harvest their wisdom. So I think that's really the answer is what would you do? You would lead with your heart. You'd lead with empathy and compassion, and you'd find out and determine how best to do that so that you're not disrupting a family that might be in pain, that sees you not as you, Jamie, because it's not about you. They see your title. And that's why they're not seeing you in that moment. And you know, the person who cares so deeply for others. It takes its toll though. I'll tell you.
I can't empathize on either end. As a parent, it's the kind of thing as a parent that I can't even watch on TV. And it's very hard for me to consider that kind of a situation.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say I really enjoyed this conversation with Veronica. I think it was a sobering one, and she did it with such great energy and enthusiasm for the district she has supported, the district she continues to support, her state level leadership role that she's had in a very large state that is so incredibly complex. And I just was grateful for her time. So this was great fun.
It's great. Good. I'm glad. I'm not as up on this one. It just is not something, it feels heavy. And I just want to say
well, you know what? Sometimes you say to me, that after action review could have been more detailed. This one had all of it.
Yes. 100%. 100% to that.
Yeah. All right. Look, I will see you next week.
Yeah. I'll see you next week. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Jamie. You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.